So today we're going to talk about Don't You Bring Me No Bad News. Or first, are we going to do special music? No? We've done the special music. So if I can, first slide. There it is. Don't You Bring Me No Bad News. How to Find Peace in Today's World. And I have on the other side of the slide WWJD, which I know is a little bit corny these days, but I still kind of like that What Would Jesus Do thing. I really do. So we can talk a little bit about this. It's been a pretty stressful couple of weeks, several weeks, I'd say, in America and around the world. A lot has been going on that seems a little bit stressful. I mean, we had the horrible tragedy of the Boston Massacre. Did I just say that? Wow. The Boston Marathon tragedy. And, you know, right behind that, we had the mining town that got blown up with the fertilizer stuff. And then there was an earthquake in China that killed almost 10,000 people. I mean, it's depressing, isn't it? It's like, who wants to talk about this stuff? It's tough. And I know when we come to our spiritual centers, you know, we want to hear these yay, uplifting messages, but sometimes I think we need to talk about this stuff and figure out what can we do to live in a world today that has this kind of tragedy and sadness and fear going on. I mean, we can't just put it under a bushel because it's real. And so what do we do with that information, you know? How do we live with that? In the times of upheaval and strife like we have right now, sometimes don't you feel like you want to say this to people? Don't you bring me no bad news. I don't want to hear that anymore. That's getting old. It really is. So, you know, what do you do? What do you do? Are there things that you can do to make the bad news seem a little bit better, or maybe take what is in the bad news and turn it around and find the goodness so that we're able to help some of those people that are going through these tragedies? You know, that's what I decided I wanted to do. I was like really depressed when all of these bad things started happening. It got me down. So I went on the internet, which is where I live, and I started looking around for a verse or a saying or a quotation or something that would make me feel better so that I could go on and get up in the morning and know that everything was okay, that the world was still going on, that in all of the chaos there really is order. And we all know that, but sometimes we forget it, right? So what I did, I went on and I looked around, and if you'll show the next slide, I found something that was, and then the next slide after that, please. Yeah, I found something called a life verse. How many of you have ever heard of a life verse? I hadn't either. I'd never heard. I was like, what is that, right? What I found out was that a life verse is something that you can find, usually a scripture or a sacred saying or something like that, that really, really sings to your heart whenever you're in trouble, or there is trouble, or you're feeling troubled. And so I was like, well, how do I go about finding a life verse? I mean, my goodness, in the Bible alone, there are 31,000 verses. I mean, how in the world could I pick out just one? And if I didn't even go to the Bible, if you'll go to the next slide, we have so many other sources. These are just some of our authors at Unity who are at Unity today who have written amazing books and papers. Some of these people are my beloved professors, and all of them have written things. And if I didn't go there, there are countless others like Deepak Chopra, Khalil Gibran, Thich Nhat Hanh, just so many places. I was like overwhelmed. How in the world could I select one verse that was going to work for me and work for me for the next 10 years maybe, or the rest of my life maybe? I was not quite sure. It took me a long time to figure it out. It took me several days actually to figure it out. And I'd read verses aloud to see how they fit. And finally, I came across the one that really, really sings to me. And I really want to encourage you all to find your life verse as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The one that sings to me, if you'll, my next slide. This is the one. It's Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Wow, I thought that's pretty simple. That's not that hard. I could probably do that one. I think I'll choose that as my life verse, and so I have. And at first I thought, well, I can just go around, affirming this and saying this, and everything will be fine. And then I was led through prayer to look at it a little bit deeper. What does this verse really mean to me? What else is going on here? What happened before these words were said? What happened after? Micah is the guy that spoke the words, and he was a prophet in the Old Testament. Who was he saying this to? And why did he say this? And I wanted to know some of these things. So the first thought that came to me was, Micah said these words because he was helping the people of that time to get aligned with God. And there was a reason they needed to. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. The other thing, it answered my question about what would Jesus do? These words were actually written in the Old Testament. Micah's a little tiny book in the Old Testament, but it is absolutely chock full of great information. They call him a minor prophet, but the reason they do is because the book of Micah is little tiny. Micah predicted and prophesied so many amazing things. Some people even think that he prophesied the birth of the Messiah. And there are just many other really amazing things, some of which did come true, it seems. So he's a pretty smart guy back in the day. So Jesus, I wondered, would he have read this as a young boy? I mean, it was in the Hebrew Bible, and Jesus, that's what he was taught. So I thought, I wonder if Jesus read that. And even though he didn't speak those words himself, to me it seemed like Jesus exemplified these principles. He walked his life in this way by acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with his God. So all that sounded pretty good to me so far. But I wanted to know more. So I went into the history of the whole thing. And it's very interesting if you go back and look at some of the Bible stories and look at the history. And I will tell you, I didn't do that before I came to Unity. I was raised Southern Baptist, and I was very hands-on with the Bible, but we didn't really look at the history of things so much. And I have found so much interesting information that is so pertinent to us today by looking at some of the history. The first fact that I found out was that according to the traditional interpretations of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, this passage was spoken by a man named Micah who lived in the 8th century BCE, this was before the birth of Christ, in a town called Moresheth Gath. If you'll just give me that next slide. This is hard to see, but Moresheth was here, and let's see if I can find it. Not too far up on the map is Jerusalem. Moresheth was built as a protection for Jerusalem. There were several small towns built around Jerusalem that protected it from invaders, and this was one of them. So Moresheth was located about 25 miles from Jerusalem, and there were people that lived there at the time who had gotten a little bit too big for their britches, let's say. They had been through a lot of hard times, and so they had gotten really protective of their stuff. Their stuff was starting to mean a lot to them. And so Micah was told by God in this story through a dream that he had to go to Moresheth and tell these people, you can't do what you're doing anymore. This is not a good idea, because if you do, I'm going to get you. And of course, that's what they believed back in those days in the Bible, that God was, a God that could get you. And so that's what they believed. And Micah had to go and tell these people that. And he was not happy about it, and I can only imagine. Because these people had become pretty corrupt. Their leaders had taught them that it was okay to just, if you wanted somebody's land, just take it. If you want somebody's property or their business or their wife or whatever, just take it. No problem. Everybody can take what they want. It's no big deal. And they were pretty doggone corrupt in a lot of ways. They treated women and children very badly. They stole from one another. The politics were completely corrupt. Does any of this sound like anything today? That's what I kept thinking too. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. This is sounding a little bit familiar here. So, so what had happened with them is because they'd been in lots of wars. They were always warring back then, as you know. And they'd been in lots of wars. And so because of that, they were in fear, and they were in lack, and they were in scarcity. And so they were grabbing up everything they could, right, to keep for themselves. They started grabbing up stuff. And, you know, I started thinking, different times I know in my life and in the lives of other people I've known, and in the world in general, when people get into lack, they start grabbing it up. They don't want to share it anymore. They want to keep it for themselves, and they'll do just about anything to protect it. And isn't that where a lot of war starts? You know, not only big wars, but wars between our friends, our family, you know, and even in ourselves, we can war when we feel that we are not connected to the oneness of God. And these people, I think, were definitely feeling disconnected back then. So as the story goes, Micah has the vision or dream, and he's got to go tell these people. And he also had to tell them that there were lots of prophets out there like him who were delivering messages that weren't very good, and they were doing it for the money. I am just thinking, if I were Micah and I had to go tell these to these people, I would so not be happy. It'd be kind of scary. So I figured Micah might have bargained with God a little bit. Maybe he said, why me? What if they kill me? Can't we find another way to do this? I'm a little bit busy today. Can you send somebody else? Well, what about if I just give you a couple of burnt offerings? Would that work? I mean, come on, God. Can we bargain here? And no, the answer was no. So Micah, being a good and faithful servant, went. You know? How many of you ever felt that way when you had to deliver a bad message? It's like, oh, man, don't make me have to go to tell that bad news, right? I don't want to tell. It's hard sometimes to tell the truth when our voice shakes, but we know we can do it anyway. With God's help, we know that. And maybe your life verse will give you a little bit of help doing that too. So anyway, he goes to tell the people, and he calls them out on their bad behavior. And what they say to Micah is, the next slide, don't you bring me no bad news, Micah. I don't want to hear this stuff. Everything's working great for me out here. Who needs God? I've got stuff. Look at all this stuff I've collected. Who needs God? Good, get out of here. But then they started thinking, and they were like, Micah said, God's not happy. And they said, well, what if we bargain with God? What if we start bargaining with God? Has anybody ever done? I've never done. I know people that have done that. Oh, I've never done. Oh, well, okay, a little bit sometimes. So they started bargaining with God, and you know they said, okay, God, what do you want? What do you want? You want money? You want more sacrifices? How many? How many cows? How many chickens? How many sheep do you want? I've got plenty. I'll sacrifice all day long. You know, and they weren't really repentant. They just were asking God, what was his price? What is God's price? Oh, my goodness. I know we get into that boat sometimes. Then they started asking questions like, what if we sacrifice our own children to you? Will you leave us alone then? Will you just go away and leave us alone? Now that's pretty scary. That's pretty, I want to say corrupt, if you would sacrifice your own children just so that you can have your stuff. And that's pretty much where they are. And sometimes I think, well, I know there are people in the world today, unfortunately, that will do that. It's pretty dark. So they asked God, what do you want? And through the mouth of the prophet Micah, what God said was, the next slide, this is what God said to them. I don't want your stuff. I don't want you to sacrifice anything. All I want you to do is to act justly and to love mercy and to walk kindly with your God. That's all. That's it. Pretty easy. Pretty easy. So, how does all of this relate to us today, you know? I mean, this was a long time ago when this happened. But acting justly, loving mercy, and walking kindly, doesn't that seem like something that if we did that in the world, each one of us as individuals, maybe we could make a difference on this planet? I think so. I really do. And it's about walking kindly, or acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly not only on the outside in our daily lives, but in our hearts, to really do that. So, how do we do that? How do we find the strength to go on whenever the world seems turned upside down? And I know that what has worked for me is my life verse. It's really helped me a lot. I looked at what does that mean to me, to act justly. I mean, it means being fair and impartial. Being just means being fair and impartial. It means treating everybody else and everything else like the living Christ. When I read that, I was like, wow. If I could keep that consciousness 24/7, that would probably make a big, big difference in my life. It means refraining from lying and cheating and not mistreating other people, of course. It means acting from my highest Christ self, even when it isn't easy. And especially when dealing with ethical and moral issues, to be sure that I am, what would Jesus do? Am I acting from that? And above all, it means forgiveness, which is huge. Loving kindness means to have compassion, and again, forgiveness. It means, I love this, loving the opportunity to extend kindness and mercy to others under all circumstances, and not just when it's easy. Loving the opportunity to extend kindness. Wow. Looking for the opportunities. And of course, walk humbly is live in harmony with the oneness. Not to be so ego-proud or arrogant, but to know our true worth and our true selves as part of the oneness. And then not to be cocky about that, but to be grateful for that experience. And each one of us has that experience. It means surrendering our ego-driven personality to the magnificence of the kingdom of God. And then we can be the hands and feet, the mouthpiece of God, the outer expression of God here on earth. Because the truth is, we are all part of God. And yet it's so easy sometimes we forget that, don't we? And we get caught up in the world, and then we start believing that our leading comes from the outside, not the inside. And that's when we get trapped. And that's when the stuff starts meaning more than what's inside of us. The people of Micah's time fell into that trap really big. And I believe that when we see strife here on our planet today, it's because the people here on this planet today fall into that trap as well. They forget who they are, that they really are part of the Christ, and that Christ lives inside, within each one of us. God is in our being, and we are in God's being. We have that spark of divinity. Each one of us has that spark, and everybody has that spark of divinity, and sometimes that's hard to remember whenever you hear about a couple of kids that went and blew up a bunch of people in Boston. Even they have that spark of divinity. And that's when we have to practice forgiveness. Not to say it's okay. What they did was certainly not okay. But we don't know their story. And all we can do is practice forgiveness, even when we don't understand. So there's some other tools that I found too that could help us as we go through and try to make sense of some of the craziness in the world. One of them, of course, is prayer. And we all know about prayer and unity. The 5-step prayer process, if you're familiar with that, first you concentrate. First you relax, First you relax. Then you concentrate. Then you meditate. Embrace the silence, and then give thanks. And also, of course, using denials and affirmations is a great way to create peace within. The next thing is meditation. If you just can take time to sit and listen in the silence for 5 minutes a day, anytime. In your car, when the light turns red, stop and practice the silence. That just connects you with God. That gives a time. I always say prayer is us speaking to God, and silent or meditation is God speaking to us. We allow the silence so that we can hear the Word of God. And I think that helps me in these times to feel safer whenever it's crazy. Just if I can get quiet within myself, it really helps. Reflection. is a good tool. If you can ask yourself some questions about your life verse and your relationship to the oneness, through reflection, sometimes we may find out that we have fallen a little bit short of our highest intentions, and it can feel pretty painful, but the cool thing about reflection is you can jump back on that bus, you can jump back on that wagon, and you can say, okay, do-over. That's the thing I love about this world. We have do-overs, and that's a good thing. The other thing is hanging out with uplifting people, which is we're all here today doing that. And I love that, and it's so wonderful. Thank you all so much for letting me be here with you today. And I just, it says in the Bible, Matthew 18:20, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there am I also. And that's really the truth. The other thing is you can read sacred scriptures and uplifting passages. That really helps us to keep on the right track and to remember. One of the things I also read in Micah was Micah 4:6, and this was really another great passage. I thought this guy's great. He said, he will arbitrate between many peoples and settle disputes between many distant nations. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not use weapons against other nations, and they will no longer train for war. I want to pray about that. I want to vision that big time. And speaking of visioning, the next thing you can do, if you can show me my next slide. How many of you have ever done a spiritual vision map? Awesome. Have you had good luck with it? Have things happened positively because of your vision map? They have for me too. And I like to use, it's hard to see in the center of that, but I like to use my life verse in the middle of my spiritual vision map and then put words around that are things that I want to draw into my life, especially in light of my life verse. Charles Fillmore said in his book, Christian Healing, nothing shall be impossible unto you if your faith is in spirit and if your work is in harmony with divine mind. And I think that's why spiritual vision maps work. Another of Mr. Fillmore's life verses was Colossians 1:27, which was Christ in you, the hope of glory. That was one of his life verses. And if you go to Unity Village, there's a room called the Shining Words Room, and around the top of the room are many, many of Mr. Fillmore's favorite life verses, and that happens to be one of them. And we know that he demonstrated that words have power, so be sure that the words that you use, you choose very carefully. So we like to do these spiritual vision maps, and you can hang it in your house and look at it, or in your office and look at it, and you will be really, really surprised at how much comes true. And I think that one of the reasons it comes true, there's a minister today called Creflo Dollar. Has anybody heard of him? He is a television minister and probably a prosperity gospel minister, I would say, probably. Funny guy. He's really a funny guy. But anyway, one of the things he said, words are like containers. So find a life verse that can be the container of your highest hopes and dreams of peace and prosperity in all its many forms for yourself and for the planet. Words are containers. I really like that thought. And of course, the last is forgiveness. Forgiveness of yourself, especially, and a forgiveness of others. We cannot forgive others until we forgive ourselves. We're all free. We all have free will to take the easy way by dwelling in spirit, or the hard way by choosing to find our peace on the outside of ourselves. Which will you choose? You're a prophet. You are a prophet sent here with the capability and the charge to bring yourself more closely into relationship with God, and by doing so, you are a living demonstration of peace in this world. So let us reconnect ourselves to hearing the ancient words of Micah in a way that we can use today in our own lives so that we can bring peace, forgiveness, balance, and joy to our planet. Let us do what Jesus, our way shower, did. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God. Namaste. And now I'd like to ask you if you'll join me in meditation.